The Dole Institute for hosting this again. We appreciate their hospitality. They've been fantastic to work with. I need to ask a question of Mr. Bob Miller, if he still has some books available or not for sale.
They're available back in my office. I'm selling them and mailing them.
He's selling them and mailing them is what he's doing. So
All the others are gone.
all the others are gone right now. So please talk with Mr. Miller and order your book when you get a chance. Our next speaker that we have is a local speaker, Mr. Dan Wildcat. He is director of Haskell Environmental Research Studies Center and American Indian Studies faculty member at Haskell Indian Nations University here in Lawrence, Kansas. I'd like to have Dan come up and he can take over on his presentation. It's an honor to have him part of this diplomacy symposium here at the Dole Institute. Dan.
Halagayasawa, Chris. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this diplomacy symposium. Gelasanzo Yaha, Yuchiha, Kadane, Azadeh. Good morning. My name is Dan Wildcat, and I am a Yuchi member of the Muskogee Nation of Oklahoma, and if we wanted to talk about diplomacy and treaties and identity and recognition, we could do a whole day just about the Zoyaha, the Yuchis, who, as I jokingly say, are misrecognized by the United States government as part of the Creek Nation. We were indeed part of a confederacy with the Muskogee peoples at the time of removal from the southeastern United States to eastern Oklahoma, but that's not the topic I'm going to talk about today, and I'm really honored to be here and have this opportunity. And Bob did such a great job of sort of laying out for me a foundation I can build on. So here's the challenge I'm going to try to ask myself if I can meet it. I think there's so much to talk about when we start talking about the history, the legacy, and the continuity of quote unquote Indian education as it exists today, as we're sitting here this morning, that I would like to sort of, treat a very complicated, a very complex history, paint a picture with really broad brushstrokes, but I think it'll be one that hopefully will not be inaccurate. In other words, I'm going to try to give you some fundamental themes that I think are widely accepted by many indigenous American Indian historians about the history of the boarding schools. So there's nothing necessarily unique in what I'm going to present, although I guess there's one piece of it that I sort of emphasize, and I'm greatly indebted to my friend and mentor, Vine Deloria Jr., for really probably influencing my own scholarship about the way I think about what it means to be a people, capital P, part of a people today in this United States of America. And that's sort of thinking about the power of place. And I think in many ways what Lewis and Clark does, this first point of contact, is really reinforce the way in which the 19th century and even through the 20th century, we see that the history of the United States and our histories, as they are inextricably woven and connected into that larger history, for us must fundamentally be shaped by a notion of power, place, and peoplehood, and the attacks that we faced as indigenous peoples on that. And the boarding schools played a very, very prominent role in that sort of attempt to change who we were. So I want to start with that sort of disclaimer. It's a very complicated history. It's a very complex history. But I'm going to try to do justice here in a short presentation of, let's say, half an hour, 35 minutes, and then I'd like to open it up to questions. I'm sure you will have many questions and comments after I'm done with my remarks, because I think that's really where it gets interesting, when we can start, a dialogue about the history, the legacy, and I guess, this thing, the continuity of Indian education today. So let me take 5 minutes and try to give you a framework for understanding how we get to the boarding schools, the off-reservation boarding schools. How did we get to the first experiment at Hampton Institute, which was an institution set up for freedmen from the South, and was at one point studied very closely by a retired military officer, Captain Richard Henry Pratt, who saw really Hampton Institute and this attempt to sort of take African American newly freed men, black slaves and women, into a complete institutional setting to teach them trades and vocations. And he saw, hey, this is the way we will solve the Indian problem. Now, what was the Indian problem? Well, I'm going to suggest to you that the Indian problem was basically very much a confrontation with what Washington, Jefferson, Madison had recognized, and that was the fact, their hopes that in some way, through diplomacy and economic and commercial interaction, we would sort of assimilate into this larger society. And the failure throughout the 19th century for that to happen, for Native people to stand resolute in their notion that they saw no problem in being Pawnee, they saw no problem in being Lakota, they saw no problem in being Potawatomi, they saw no problem in being Apache, that this was sort of, from the eyes of those European Americans, this was the Indian problem. And with very broad brushstrokes, I'd suggest to you here that the 19th century can kind of be demarcated in three major policy attempts to solve the Indian problem, and one minor one, thank goodness for all of us. The first one is very clear, it's removal. And I really appreciated Bob's pointing out that removal was in the mind very early on of the so-called Founding Fathers, that this notion that it was going to be necessary to move Native peoples from their homelands west, and west of the Mississippi, west into the western plains and beyond. And how fitting is it that we're here in eastern Kansas, where many of you know, maybe in this audience, some don't, that if we looked at the landscape of the plains in 1850, we would have had to look far and wide to find a more diverse and widely numbered group of peoples, indigenous peoples, anywhere in the United States as we found in eastern Kansas. I would suggest to you that we think of the first half of the 19th century as the solution to the Indian problem was going to be removal. The land's big enough. We'll just remove Indians out of the way. And we need to disabuse ourselves of the notion that there was one trail of tears. There were many trails of tears. And again, our place names in this part of the world tell us that. Ottawa, Wyandotte County, Shawnee, okay? We start looking at, and we start looking at all of the ways in which we see sort of embodied. Miami County, we see embodied the fact that between this period of removal of the 1830s and clear up until 1850, there were a number of peoples, including our current resident tribes of Kansas, the Sac and Fox, the Kickapoo, the Iowa, and the Potawatomi, who were not native to this place, who were removed here, along with the Delaware, the Shawnee, the Wyandot, the Ottawa, the New York tribes. And depending on how you want to count these tribal distinctions, because, this becomes a big issue. How do you, separate the Stockbridge Munsees from those that are identified as the Christian Munsees, the Wea? We have... given how you would want to count the peoples, capital P, that were removed to Kansas, we'd have to say there were probably 40 nations that were removed here to this boundary on eastern Kansas and given, reservation lands. Little did we know that the Kansas-Nebraska Act was going to make their new, quote, homelands, their new reserves, basically the battleground that we now call Bleeding Kansas, the first site for the Civil War. It's bitterly ironic. I would say we have to frame Indian education and understand the first half of the 19th century, the solution to the Indian problem was removal. Really, probably up till the Civil War, that was going to be the solution. Then we have certainly a very short period of time, thankfully for everyone, where there was a solution that, if you wanted to, I guess, put it in its most diplomatic description of sort of military subjugation. We had that brief period of the Plains Indian Wars. We did have, a fairly substantial standing army, and we did have some military leaders like General Philip Sheridan, who put forth the formulation that the only good Indian was a dead Indian. And in fact that, okay, we solved this threat to our nation, now we need to solve the Indian problem militarily. And we had this brief period of the Plains Indian Wars. And fortunately, I would say for both peoples, for European Americans, for those African American Buffalo Soldiers, and for the indigenous peoples that met on the greasy grass at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, that the demise of Custer's 7th Cavalry really made it clear that that wasn't going to happen. That this notion of a sort of a military subjugation, or painted in its worst light, some notion of sort of an ethnic cleansing or genocidal policy, would not be feasible in the United States of America. So, that's not going to work. What happens? Well, and again, this really fits so nicely with the larger contours of American history, I think. We come up with the classic liberal solution to problems. The classic liberal solution of education. That's how we're going to solve the drug problem today. That's how we're going to solve gangs. That's how we're going to solve climate change. I mean, education is going to be the solution. And Richard Henry Pratt had observed what had happened at Hampton Institute. In fact, there's a fascinating history to be written there about the period of time where Hampton Institute had, black freedmen and American Indians both at that campus together. In fact, W.E. Du Bois was apparently a dormitory staff person when that first group of Indians had been there at Hampton and met some of these young Native men and women that were sent there. But I think that we see this attempt to solve the Indian problem. So it became very clear, okay, by the time we get to the late 1870s, one, that it's going to be impossible to solve the Indian problem by removal unless we're just going to literally push all of the Indians into the Pacific Ocean. That's not going to be feasible. And we see that really the notion of sort of a military subjugation, or ethnic cleansing, if we will, of the landscape of Native peoples is not going to be feasible. It really became a sort of a cause célèbre among abolitionists, people who were abolitionists. They had won that battle, and now they're on to what's the next cause, and it was the plight of the noble red man and what was going on, and people could see that, in fact, Native people were being treated in very unjust ways. And so, what was the solution going to be? Education. And I think the startling thing about this sort of solution to the Indian problem, and I'm going to suggest this is really, why education became such a Indian education, and particularly the off-reservation boarding schools, became such a feature of federal Indian policy, and continues to this day to be a fairly substantial part of federal Indian policy, is because, in a way, what I would like to suggest to you is that the notion that if you moved people, the notion that, if you fought wars with them, the notion that if you took missionaries to them, somehow that Native people would give up who they were as distinct peoples was beginning to be very clear that was not going to happen. And so we get to this solution proposed of the off-reservation Indian boarding schools. And I want to read you, Richard Henry Pratt is often mentioned when we talk about the off-reservation boarding schools, because he was the architect in many ways of this. And remember, these schools, Carlisle, Hampton, they were identified as United States Industrial Training Institutes. Many of you know this here who've lived in Lawrence, that the first name of the Haskell Institute was the United States Indian Industrial Training School. That was how the name, when it opened its doors in 1884. And you figure that time in U.S. history, you can see the impetus, let's get these young Native boys and girls trained to be a part of this modern industrial economy of the late 19th century. The thing that is shocking in retrospect to us, and I always like to point this out because I'm going to read you some direct quotations from a speech that Richard Henry Pratt made at the 19th Annual Conference of Charities and Correction in 1892. This would have been 8 years after Haskell came into being. But this is when, really Richard Henry Pratt was seen as sort of the guiding kind of theorist and expert on Indian education. This is a speech he made at this 19th Annual Conference on Charities and Correction, 1892, in Denver, Colorado, because I want to put something in context about his assessment of the Indian problem, the last decade of the 19th century. He says, "A great general has said the only good Indian is a dead one, and the high sanction of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man." Fairly chilling, I would say, regardless of your political ideology today. I think we find these words kind of chilling. It's interesting as you go through the speech that it's really sort of a discussion of how important it is, and this is why I think Lewis and Clark are a good place to start a discussion of Indian education, What I would suggest to you is the issue with Lewis and Clark, the issue with removal, the issue with the Plains Indian Wars, the issue with Indian education, and probably the final initiative, which I'll talk about here in a few minutes, the General Allotment Act, or the Dawes Act, has always been the land. It's been about the land. And the most devastating thing about the policies of the United States government towards Native peoples has been there has been a complete inability to recognize that the beauty of this multitude of peoples who inhabited this landscape and these seascapes is that our identities, and I really marveled at Bob pointing this out. Thanks, Bob. This was a great illustration of the Delaware flag, of the cougar, of the mountain lion, of the swan. If you knew anything about where the Delaware resided, these were animals that they shared their homeland with. In a world today where we think identities can be purchased on a self-help shelf at Borders or Barnes & Noble, where we go shopping for lifestyles, the beauty of indigenous traditions, tribal traditions, are they were emergent out of the landscapes, those Great Lakes, those rivers, those mountains, those valleys, those landscapes, those seascapes, where we took our identity. And removal must have been devastating, must have been incredibly painful for people who understood who they were as very much situated as a part of these landscapes. Knowing the plants, knowing animals, knowing how to collect, knowing how to harvest. Well, it's interesting because when you look through Pratt's speech, what you begin to realize is that Pratt actually, I think, understood this in a sort of devious way, that we had to take children away from their people, away from their place, or we were going to be unsuccessful. The same speech, let me tell you what he says about the schools and the efforts that were going on with missionaries in Africa and with Africa. And look at what he emphasizes here. He says, left in Africa, left in their own land, surrounded by their fellow savages, are 7 millions of industrious black fellow citizens would still be savages. Transferred into these new surroundings and experiences, behold the result. Talk about manifest destiny. Talk about hubris. They became English-speaking and civilized because forced into association with English-speaking and civilized people. They became healthy and multiplied because they were property. This is incredible. The industrious because industry, which brings contentment and health, was a necessary quality to increase their value. If you want to get a notion of the devastating nature of what boarding schools meant to nations, to our societies, to our families, to our communities, you have to recognize children being placed in these almost Irving Goffman would call total institutions. This is a sociologist who studied the way you take total institutions. He mainly focused on prisons and mental institutions, how you take people in there and totally try to remold them. And this is what the boarding schools were going to do. They were going to kill the Indian, destroy the Indian to save the man. But he seems to recognize this, and in this speech, and it's already occurred, but I think Bob did a marvelous job in pointing this out. Let's move to the kind of, so I'm sort of representing there were 4 policy solutions to the Indian problem, and several worked in concert, but we had removal. That didn't work. They couldn't put us at all in the Pacific Ocean. We had the Plains Indian Wars, thank goodness. The battle at the Greasy Grass and demise of Custer's 7th Cavalry ended that policy. Then we had Indian education, the off-reservation boarding schools, the creation of these total institutions that we're going to solve by what? Taking the Indian out of the children. I've got another quote I'll read to you in a second about that. But it was always recognized that this, by Pratt and by people who were very insightful and lived among and observed Indians, it was about their relationship to land. And this is what had to be attacked. He says, we have never made any attempt to civilize them with the idea of taking them into the nation, he says, and this has been a kind of a mistake. We've got to find a way to do this. We are after the facts. Let us take the land in severalty bill. Land in severalty as administered is in the way of individualizing and civilization of the Indians. This notion that lands held by a people, capital P, a nation, in common, had to be broken up, and people had to be learned the responsibility in the civilized way to manage lands as private property. And the Dawes Act, this General Allotment Act, was, I think, really the kind of pinnacle of thinking about how to solve the Indian problem. So as this goes through discussion in 1886 and passage in 1887, that they're going to undertake this way to give each individual holder, each individual tribal member their lands. By the way, after that calculation was made of how much land there would after you gave each individual tribal member 160 acres, you're obviously going to have a lot of surplus. In one fell swoop, Congress, using its plenary power, decided that all of that surplus land, we went from roughly 100 and almost 40 million acres. I'll give you the exact numbers. I have to look at my paper here in a second, but roughly about 140 million acres down to about 50 million acres. The balance, that 2/3 of that, was declared surplus and made the property of the United States of America. That's all it took. That's all it took. You put together this sort of diminution of the lands that Native people had to live on. You put together this notion that you're going to remove children from their families, as a common phrase you see in Bureau of Indian Affairs reports at the time. We've got to get children. Schools even on the reservations aren't good enough. Why? Because they're still among their people. They'll revert back. They'll go back to the blanket. They won't truly become civilized. We've got to remove these children so that they may be civilized. I think this kind of formulation is really, what the off-reservation boarding schools were about. And so you've got this sort of really two-pronged attack, and they're about, sort of separating any notion of these children's, not separating, just completely eliminating any sense of their indigenous, their tribal identities, giving them a new identity. Now, Pratt was fond of metaphor, and in another speech he made, I believe this was a speech or maybe it was something he wrote, I've got a quote I want to read you here because it is so compelling again to see the way the thinking about what the boarding schools could do, what they were capable of doing, and what Pratt hoped they would do. And it really is. It's quite fascinating when you look at the quotes. And this is one that I think is really interesting. So here again is Pratt, and this comes from Richard Henry Pratt. This is from something he wrote in 1883 and in correspondence. And the metaphor here again is very compelling. In Indian education, I am a Baptist because I believe in immersing the Indians in our civilization. And when we get them under, let's a good old Baptist baptism. When we get them under, holding them until they are thoroughly soaked, 8 years, 7 to 8 years, 9 years, 10 years in an off-reservation boarding school. Convert him in all ways but color into a white man, and in fact, the Indian would be exterminated, but humanely, and as beneficiary of the greatest gift at the command of the white man, his own civilization. Well, I've got bad news for Richard Henry Pratt. We're still here. As you heard this morning, we still sing our songs. We still have languages. By the way, wasn't that great this morning? A lot of you I know probably weren't here, but those of you who are here this morning, talk about a demonstration of power. I'm going to tell my grandchildren about how I sat at the Dole Center one day, and when those beautiful Potawatomi singers sang that honor song, the alarms went off. The Indians are here. I don't know how many of you were here, but no, when they were singing their song, and all of a sudden the alarms started going off here. The Indians are here. Look out. I thought that's beautiful. Power. There's power in language, there's power in song, there's power in ceremony, and Richard Henry Pratt would probably be very displeased. I guess he is, maybe in some respect, if he looked at what was going on in Indian education today. See, here's the problem. When I give this presentation, people are going to, if I stopped right here, people would leave and they'd go, oh, how horrible, how awful. And yet that's only part of the story. That's only one part of the story. Because what we all know and what we've read from people like, Bruno Bettelheim and many people who've looked at people who've been through incredibly traumatic situations, what we all know and what we conceive and in our families and communities today is that children are incredibly resilient. And when I came to Haskell 23 years ago, I talked to my aunts and uncles. My dad and his brothers were graduates of Chilocco Indian Boarding School right across the border from Ark City there in north central Oklahoma. My dad was trained as a printer at Chilocco. And, so I had a sense of the boarding schools, but, I was college educated, and I'd read all these books about how bad the boarding schools were. And then I got to Haskell, and I started meeting some of these incredible alumni still around, the Kidwells, Turner Cochran. I'm talking about people who were at Haskell in the bad old days when you wore military uniforms and got up before 6, did your chores, and then did your drill exercise and marching out there on the grounds. And how did I understand the love that these people had for that place? How did I understand how, in spite of all of the trauma, the pain that undoubtedly separation from home, people felt when they came to those places, that children are resilient. And what did they do? They figured out ways to survive. And they made friends. And they made friends across tribal lines. Potawatomis met Pawnees. Pawnees met people from Montana, Assiniboine Sioux. People met people from Apache from Arizona, Seminole from Florida. And, probably the greatest irony of the boarding schools is that even amongst the attempts to totally erase notions of and any sense of pride, in those identities of those children, is that children found out ways to express pride in who they were as Native peoples, even in the center of those boarding schools that were designed out, to erase that. How did they do it? They did it in athletics. They did it in sports. You guys, let's remember something. In the late 20s, when we had, everyone talked about, these great football teams of the East and the Ivy League and Army and Navy, those kind of glory days, early days of collegiate football. When they came here to Haskell and played Haskell, those teams got beat. Boy, I would have loved to sit in that stadium when the Haskell Indians beat Army. Wouldn't that been great? That would have been fantastic. I would have loved to have been there. So it didn't quite work. It hadn't quite worked out the way Richard Henry Pratt thought. And I think the challenge, about Indian education is that, okay, I'm going to be provocative here because I want to save some time for questions, but let me put forward something I've been thinking about a lot. I've talked about how I think in many respects, part of what was really threatened by these boarding school experiences was the fact that people had cultures and identities that connected them very clearly to particular landscapes. That's how you explain the diversity of Native people. I mean, if you think about it, why would you expect a White Mountain Apache to be like a Passamaquoddy from Maine? Would they live in the same kind of dwellings? Would they wear the same kind of clothes? Would they eat the same kind of food? Of course not. Would Coast Salish people, along the northwest coast, would you expect them to have ceremonies like the Seminole of Florida? I don't think so. It's such a basic lesson, and we've forgotten it. We don't think about ourselves that way anymore. I think the boarding schools were certainly an attempt to erase that connection between people and place and expressions of power in the world. And I would suggest to you that maybe the inheritance that we should take from Lewis and Clark lies less on the side of singing the praises of the surveyors and their attempt to incorporate indigenous peoples into an American legal and diplomatic and political system. But the real legacy, the unclaimed inheritance that we still haven't given proper attention to, is the lessons that could be learned by a very modern humankind that seems to not be living very well today on this Mother Earth. That we seem to be creating all kinds of chaos, all kinds of destruction, all kinds of death. See, I don't think this is a romantic formulation at all. I think if climate change and global warming, and this is where most of my work's been in the last couple of years, if we look at that, I would argue that maybe the problem humankind has found is that we spend so much time in spaces like this, we forget how dependent we are on that life that resides beyond these walls. We take it for granted, out of sight, out of mind. There are peoples on the planet, indigenous peoples all around the planet, still today, who have knowledge about how to live well in particular landscapes, seascapes, ecosystems, biomes, environments. I would suggest to you, as we think about Lewis and Clark and their legacy, that we think about the incredible diversity of people they met on that journey as they traveled up the Missouri. People living in earth lodges, people living in teepees, people who knew how to live on those landscapes sustainably, fairly well, created social institutions, ceremony, custom, habit that were representative of these places. And we can go all over the planet, in North America, the Great Lakes, the Desert Southwest, the Everglades, the Forest of New England, what's left of them. And we see that native people were not romantically connected to these places. They were practically in their life way connected. Maybe that is a lesson that we could learn, a true indigenous education lesson. And so Haskell Indian Nations University today, we're a place where we've got scholars, people like Dr. Vanita Chennault, where we have scholars, people like Mike Tosi, we have Potawatomi scholars, we have Comanche scholars, Julia Goodfox, a Pawnee scholar, who now are engaged in talking about our history, our values. And so Richard Henry Pratt would be displeased, because we're not talking about how we are going to become more civilized. We are talking about how we can become better human beings on this planet by recognizing the knowledge that's contained in our own languages, in our own customs, in our own habits, in our own social institutions, in our own values. And today, I think, in many places, particularly the tribal college movement in the United States, we can truly talk about indigenous education. Education that's not just the dominant institution of education where you plug native students into it, but where we're taking the time to try to develop our own models of education based on those knowledges that were given to us by our ancestors. I'm thankful for the elders who are here today, because we owe so much to them. It's kind of funny how we think of, we think of in the communities that I've been fortunate to move through, my own Yuchi community, but many native communities, when it gets right down to it, the people that we really look to as our, I guess I would say our sort of wisdom keepers aren't the people who have a lot of letters after their names, MA or PhD, but they're people who have displayed that resilience. And it's full of struggle, it's full of pain, but there's a lot of happiness there. And I'm thankful for the elders who are here today. And I'm going to stop there because I've just painted the briefest picture of what we should be talking about when we talk about Indian education. But I will suggest to you that there is an unclaimed inheritance in this nation, and it still hasn't been claimed or recognized. And it's the knowledge and wisdom that resides among Native people and the power they possess in the places they call home. Thank you very much. And I'd love to have questions.
Yes, now we're going to have an open question and answer session here for the next few minutes, and I'll give Dan a few minutes just to kind of catch his breath and collect his thoughts. And do want to remind you that we do have a lunch break coming up at noon until 1:30. We're going to give you a chance to experience some of the good food here in Lawrence, either on 23rd Street or on 6th Street, and we'll give you directions here shortly at the next break to get you to a restaurant here soon. So anyway, any questions for Dan here?
Questions, please. Yes.
What's your thoughts about the future of educational institutes on the reservations themselves, and how could that be made into part of this whole thing you're talking about?
I think it's very hopeful. In fact, I think probably, now I'm not going to give you exact numbers, but of the probably 36 or 37 member institutions we have of something called the American Indian Higher Education Consortium. This is a consortium of tribal colleges and universities. About 30, well, I think all of them but two, Haskell and Sippy, reside, within the boundaries of native reservations. And I think those of us who are really committed to working in Indian higher education believe that these ought to really be our indigenous think tanks for the future. That we ought to be, studying architecture. We ought to be looking at quote-unquote natural resource management. That we ought to be looking at renewable energy strategies through the prism of our own, tribal experiences and knowledge of landscapes. I mean, I heard Bob Goff and, of course, Winona LaDuke. Both individuals have been very active in looking at renewable energy strategies, and I heard Winona give a presentation, and the tribes of North Dakota, they're in a pretty windy landscape. And if they chose to do it, I'm not saying they should, but the reality is if they wanted to go into wind generation, they would have enough energy essentially to provide energy to all of the major cities along the Great Lakes and close to it, and then plenty left over. I think he said Minneapolis and then east through the Great Lakes. I mean, this is incredible. To think about that. I think this is the kind of thing, and solar, just what we can do in terms of design. My colleagues get tired of me talking about this. My big issue lately has been just design and architecture issues. Some of the biggest carbon sinks we have are buildings such as this, the kind of buildings that we reside in. We're completely dependent on central air and heating. What happened to windows that you could open? What happened to walls that you could reposition? My people had that. They were called lean-tos, wiki-ups. You live in Georgia in the summer and you don't have central air, you better find a way to take the wall down to get a breeze. One of our clans, one of the few clans we have among our people that is not an animal is a wind clan. And I think that tells us how important and how thankful we were for that wind if you were living in Georgia. Okay? So, a good question. I think the tribal colleges are really hold tremendous capability as being the sort of indigenous think tanks we need. And I think they have knowledge that will be transferable to the larger society that we're a part of. Yeah. Good question. Thank you. Other questions, please. Two back here. The first lady. Oh, we've got one here. Okay, I'm sorry.
Okay. I have a comment to make and appreciate what you said about children being incredibly resilient. My mother was the oldest. I am half Oneida Indian, and my mother came from Wisconsin back in the mid-30s to attend Haskell. So I presume that would be like the high school era that Haskell. And I know she was always proud of her heritage, but and I knew she was being educated, but she also went through an emotional time because she did not understand why. I mean, she was a young age. She was like 13 or 14. You imagine someone going that far. And she always thought that her parents sent her away because they did not love her. And that just shows how the family was broke up. You know, she didn't realize that they wanted her to be educated, but at the same time, they were taking her from her reservation. And but those things are the things that have caused me to continue to yearn to know why she felt the way she did, what she went through. And I've talked to my relatives. I've gone back and attended the powwows because powwows were not something that I grew up going to, or even dressing out in Indian attire. That was so new to me. So, you know, I was able to educate myself by going back there and just talking among the people, the tribe, and have learned so much just by, you know, educating myself and just learning, you know, my own identity. So I appreciate what you said.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I think it must have been terribly traumatic for children often, you know, not understanding fully what was going on. Yeah. Here and then right behind her, Margina.
Yes, I had a question about the difference between the United States, the way they handled the indigenous culture in Central and South America, because the indigenous cultures there are so much more prevalent and they still have their own languages and there's a big family base. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Well, there certainly have been differences between the way a lot of the colonial states of Latin America have treated indigenous populations, and I think it probably depends on it's kind of interesting. To a certain extent, you get these ironic relationships. One ironic relationship would be since many of the Spanish and Portuguese originated states that you know were formed in Latin America did not exactly implement the doctrine of discovery or acknowledge, you know, native peoples in those areas, Indians, as being peoples, as being nations, you know, of having rights. And so in many ways, you know, they were sort of isolated, and often because of the nature of the geography, terrain, they could be relatively, up until a point, you know, fairly isolated. And of course, you know, that had its limits too, because we all know that during, you know, from really the period of the 1950s until very recently in Haiti, much of the military activities and paramilitary activities in Latin America that involved struggles about democracy, often Indians seem to be in the middle of that, you know, and be targets of you know, military raids and violence and so on and so forth. But I think part of it is sort of, as you get into larger areas, geographical kind of isolation, the ability to sort of, you know, remove yourself, you know, from the dominant. And it may not be so much, you know, the number of miles, it might be the nature of the terrain, the ruggedness of it, but, you know, a kind of an insulating effect. And I think that this explains some of that, although I think, again, in some ways, those of you who've looked at what's been going on in interior Brazil, at least over the last 25 years, what is heartbreaking is that you see native peoples there going through exactly what our ancestors went through a century ago. How the governments create these, they're echoes. It's the same thing. It's history repeating themselves about how they're going to go in and take care of the Indians and civilize the Indians, and how the consequences are often so deadly for Native people. Yes, but thank you. Good question.
We have time for two more questions.
Okay.
We have one back here.
I wanted to ask you, so you mentioned earlier, you said something about peoples with the capital P.
Yeah.
And there was a kind of a lively discussion yesterday at KU in a college assembly meeting among educators and some staff, administrators, on the use of indigenous people capitalized. And there's a lot of writings that they're saying that now. And I tried to explain some of the challenges with the names that we've used. So I would just like for you to speak on that, because it seemed to be a very hot topic among non-natives that didn't understand, and I know it's in a lot of writings now that a lot of indigenous leaders are using. So will you talk about that for a second?
Okay, and I'll warn you, this is my opinion, and there would be other Native people who might differ from this, but Margina's kind of asked me, how would I explain this? I would explain this quite simply, is that, we're indebted today to a lot of really good thinkers, Native thinkers. Bob Thomas, a Cherokee anthropologist, Vine Deloria Jr., a theologian, legal scholar, philosopher, who was Dakota Sioux, although he grew up most of his life on Pine Ridge Reservation among Lakota peoples. One of the things that was central in sort of their forwarding of this era of self-determination and sovereignty from a policy standpoint we live in, is they sort of took the lead in arguing that who we were had to be recognized if we were going to talk about this government-to-government relation, nation-to-nation relationship. We had to understand this in terms of peoples, capital P's. And Bob Thomas used to say, you're a people if you have, a distinct religion, if you have a distinct, what he used to call a sacred history, a set of creation stories, a stories that told about your coming into the world and where your place was in the world, and language, and custom and habit. And I think today, why so many of us prefer to identify ourselves as either nations or people, capital P, maybe as opposed to tribes, although I'm kind of on an outlier. I don't get upset about people using the word tribal, because I reject the notion that tribes in any way, shape, or form were less sophisticated political organizations than modern nation states. They were just different. So I don't accept the notion that if you refer to someone as tribal, that's a put down. Because I reject that whole notion that being a member of a tribe is any less than being a citizen of a nation. But your point, Margina, and I'll try to answer it this way. I think many of us want to use the term people because we want to embrace that notion that we do have a status as nations. We have unique cultures, languages, some more threatened than others, some more active than others, but I think that we want to articulate this as a part of sovereignty as we understand it, this notion of peoplehood. And so, yeah, we will put a capital often on P, and some of us will put a capital on indigenous. AP won't. The Associated Press still, it's small I. But anyway, okay.
We have, one last question here.
This is more of a comment than a question. This is a comment earlier that the lady asked about the Latin American indigenous peoples. Yeah. And I just want to clarify that, please do not stereotype as Latin peoples that do not consider themselves indigenous as to be nice, because my mom is from Latin America, and she is not nice. I actually... when I was getting first, about 2 decades ago, when I started getting very interested in Native American culture, she actually, and still holds this, to this day, and doesn't know about my life now, but she said I was no longer her daughter. So even the Latin American people have their own discriminations against their own indigenous peoples.
Yeah.
So that was my comment.
Now, I think, that's such a good point, because I think, again, this is the problem, in general discussions, you make generalizations, and I think, that when you look at the history of Latin America, in many respects, people have fared in some ways worse than natives in North America. And I think when you get in Latin America, I remember reading asking one of my colleagues at KU, John Hoops, who does a lot of work in Mexico and Latin America, and more recently with down in extreme southern Mexico, Chiapas, and asked him about this relationship of nation states to Indians, and he said this was just a kind of an observation he had. It seems like the further north you go, Mexicans, although they don't treat Indians well, they all like to claim this great heritage, okay? So there's something about it that they try to honor and admire, although their treatment of Indians might not quite match up. We could say the same about our nation, right? But he said the further south you go, he says, it was his sense that throughout Latin America, that really the notion of being Indian, or even, honoring Indians, declines fairly quickly, that, being Indian is not something good or to be proud of. So I want to thank you all, and I hope you're going to be able to stay around for the rest of today's program. I didn't bring any books to sell. Man, did I miss out. Darn it. Bob, I'm going to follow your lead next time. Okay. Thank you very much.